Hi, welcome back. Welcome to another special edition of Spinnaker News. I'm Sheifalika Bhatnagar, and today I'm joined by Dr. Tru Leverette, Associate Professor at the University of North Florida in the English Department. Today's topics will be Jacksonville in terms of race, diversity, and its history. How are you doing today, Dr. Everett?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Glad to be here.
Thanks for joining us. Well, today let's start off with a little bit of information about University of North Florida and what it offers for diversity and inclusiveness.
Sure. I'm sure that I can't present an exhaustive list of every department and college and what they've been doing, but some of the larger entities include the Commission on Diversity and Inclusion, which is open to faculty, staff, students as well, I believe. The DDI, the Department of Diversity Initiatives, that works with a lot of other entities on campus, including the Women's Center, the Faculty Association, which is currently hosting some conversations on race, and many other, I know, working groups and task forces right now are deep into this conversation about race, anti-racism, and inclusivity.
In terms of 2020, I think we've seen a reignition of race issues that are widespread in our whole country. And recently, the University of North Florida is looking at discussing race issues with not only their faculty, but also for their students coming in the fall semester. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those initiatives look like and how we can start that topic about race?
Well, I think the plans that are in the works again are from a number of different areas on campus. So I know that even in the past, the Women's Center and DDI have been very helpful in hosting those kinds of conversations, and I know that they're continuing to do so. In fact, I'll be speaking in a discussion or with other people in a discussion later this month through the Women's Center and on a hashtag Say Her Name topic. So even, this summer, we're already getting going with these conversations because they are so pertinent and important.
I've seen many topics, many hashtags across the social media outlets throughout the last few months that say such things as say her name or say his name when there's a victim of any kind of racial injustice in the world. Can you tell me a little bit about why it's important when somebody passes away to say their name?
I think that at the root of those hashtags, we're seeing a recognition that the problems that we're facing with racialized violence and police brutality and the criminalization of Black people and other minorities has a lot to do with the historical dehumanization of people of color and minorities in this country. So in my analysis of those hashtags, that's really about recognizing humanity and understanding that these are people who like anyone else doesn't deserve this kind of treatment.
I see. Yes, the U.S. does have a long-standing history of racial inequality, and even during the Jim Crow and slavery years, African Americans were considered 3/5 of a person, and I wonder how the old saying of those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. I wonder if you see that happening again here in 2020.
I think there are battles going on over history. I think in this country, it's pretty clear that we've been given institutionally a dominant narrative as our national history that elides actual history, that forgets and chooses to ignore or erase the full breadth of the experiences that could be shared. We might need to pause a second. It's just said my connection is unstable. Did you get what I was saying?
I believe you skipped out just a little bit. Please just repeat what you Just that.
Okay. Okay. So yes, we're contending over that issue of the full history of this country and recognition of the fact that minorities whose histories have been erased, those histories need to be told and understood fully. One of the problems I think we're having in terms of, for example, the Confederate monuments and renaming of schools is that people don't understand history, don't know not only the full history of minorities in this country, but also don't necessarily know the root of these symbols, the history of these particular symbols. And so they end up conflating these symbols with something that that isn't rooted in their real history.
It does seem like there has been a lot of momentum recently this year, but these issues of racial injustice in terms of healing from the slavery era in American history, healing from examples of police brutality or injustices. It seems like we're going all the way to the past, to these monuments, these Confederate leaders or generals or even presidents, some of them, these statues that represent a part of American history that are now being rejected by, I think, the younger generations and also just people that may never have been able to relate to these monuments in general. There seems to be a new tide or a new momentum developing. What are some of your thoughts about removing statues that may have ties to not only American history, but the Confederacy? Is that in some part blinding us more to the reality of what people of color in this country have gone through? If we take them down and they're out of sight, do they then become out of mind?
Well, I don't subscribe to the idea that by removing or moving those monuments that we are erasing or ignoring history, or that it will necessarily be forgotten. I think the question is what we are honoring, what we're trying to celebrate. That's what monuments do. So I think that there's every place for statues to be contextualized in a museum, for example, to tell a more robust version of the actual history, because as those statues stand right now, they are not telling the full history. So we are already erasing and ignoring parts of history. So I think that moving them into their proper contexts would help us tell the story more accurately rather than erasing it.
I see. That's a very interesting idea, to not necessarily destroy and decimate these statues, but to move them into a venue that can have a much more, like you said, diverse and deep dialogue about those leaders and that time in our history.
And may I just add as well, I think it's important, as I said, to honor certain things in terms of what are we wanting to celebrate, who are we wanting to celebrate, what ideas and accomplishments do we want to celebrate. So that's not to say then that every instance of remembering history is going to be a positive one. So I just want to be clear about that, but we need to have a fuller story being told.
I see. How do you feel about the emotions of grief and anger and fear that have arisen this year, not just during an already difficult year with the pandemic and everything, but also with the death of George Floyd, the reignition of the Black Lives Matter movement across the country? There's a lot of grief that our country, I see, is going through. And let's talk a little bit about what that grief is, what it feels like, and then maybe what we can learn from history on how to heal those divides.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, Sheifalika. I think we focus on the anger a lot, and there is a place for that anger. I read it as righteous anger. And so it's an anger that can be put into service of righting wrongs and rectifying wrongs. But the grief is there as well. And you ask me how I feel about these feelings, and I think that as a yoga teacher myself, also, I'm one who's comfortable with that kind of shadow work, we would call it, delving into those places that make us uncomfortable, because that's the only way we can move past those. So the grief is crucial, and I think that allowing people the time and the space to mourn, and to grieve, as you say, the loss of human life is necessary, and it's important. And it's sad and regrettable to me that memorials for victims of this kind of violence are mischaracterized so often, and so that people are not allowed their full human space in which to grieve.
I see.
And you sorry, the rest of your question was, what does allowing that grief help us do in terms of healing? I think that's the only way forward, is to recognize the full spectrum of the physical, emotional, psychological, mental impact of this kind of violence on people's lives. Mm-hmm. And for us to do it, not only for those who are victimized to do it, but for those who are in unvictimized or more powerful positions to recognize that this is what happens in people's lives. And to do something to change that.
I think those points are very interesting, and thank you for answering it, because that was a difficult question, and it's a heartfelt question to have to ask and then also to have to answer.
I appreciate that.
You're welcome. Another thing I've seen is alongside the Black Lives Matter movement, there is also another side of group of people that perhaps are now realizing that since that Black Lives Matter movement went national and then global, they're realizing that maybe there are certain privileges they weren't aware of before that they may have benefited from directly or indirectly throughout their life. So there is an awakening happening. And I've seen this meme go around the internet that says, I realize that I don't know what it actually feels like. And I changed my mind. I want to learn, right? So on one side, we have grief and pain and anger. And on the other side, we have almost a newborn curiosity about an awakening that the individual is having themselves. Do you think that the unique circumstances of this year, going through a worldwide pandemic, quarantine, isolation, is giving people more time to think about these kinds of issues and maybe grow in their own way?
That's a wonderful question. I hope so. I hope so. And I hope it's not just limited to that as well. I mean, since I wasn't alive at the time of the, mid 20th century civil rights movement, I don't know what was going on in terms of how people were awakening. I don't know the full personal and emotional nuances of that. I've read, but now in the midst of this moment, I think we are all aware, yes, we've had more time on our hands. We've had more time at home. We've had more encouragement from multiple sources to reflect, to do self-work, to practice self-care. And all of those practices, I think, really allow us the time to become a little more insightful. This is why, again, yoga teachers like me recommend meditation because because awakening happens when you take the time to reflect on yourself and your own life and experiences and choices as well, and to become a little more conscious of what has driven your own forward path. So yeah, it seems plausible that what has happened globally with the pandemic has given us this space that we didn't have more recently in which to reflect.
I can only say from my own experience and from my close loved ones that it has given us maybe more time on our hands than we were prepared for.
More time with social media too, right?
Right. And I'm curious, as a journalist and a American, I'm curious to see where our country goes when we come through this, when we've had this time for introspection, this time for thought. So I think one thing that I want to talk a little bit about Jacksonville and diversity. In my experience, Jacksonville seems to be so incredibly diverse, from different ethnic backgrounds, different nationalities, different languages, different minority groups, from the LGBTQ to people of color to Native Indian history. We have a lot of significant American history in our area, such as St. Augustine being one of the oldest city in the country. What do you think are some of the strengths and weaknesses that Jacksonville has in terms of diversity?
You're absolutely right that we are incredibly rich in diversity, historically and contemporarily. As you're mentioning, we have an incredibly rich Native and Indigenous history that Dr. Denise Bosey in the UNF History Department has a strong expertise in, and rich African American history with Fort Mose here, with Kingsley Plantation, with the reality of Axe Handle Saturday and the St. Augustine Four, and I could go on and on. James Weldon Johnson and Zora Neale Hurston. These are all a part of Jacksonville's beautifully rich racial history. And then contemporarily as well. I was in a meeting yesterday, a Zoom meeting with other colleagues, and was learning from Dr. Greg Helmick, also at UNF, about the Cuban immigration during the Jim Crow era. And he's been doing a project on that, which is fascinating. And someone else was speaking about contemporary African immigrants into this area. So it's much more diverse, I think, than most of us realize. And most of us, in the city have a tendency to think about, to forget about the fact that our diversity is not just black and white. And I think that leads directly into our weakness, that we have not acknowledged that fully. We have not respected fully the diverse population and demographic that we have here, and that it has been and still continues to be a very segregated city for the most part.
I see. That's very interesting. That our strength can lead right into that weakness of just not acknowledging it as much. I think from the history that I've studied here in Jacksonville, in this local area, Jacksonville has been converting racial tensions, historical differences into productive art forms, into productive types of communication, like from the fact that Ray Charles came here, and like the before the Harlem Renaissance there was the Jacksonville musical Renaissance, and we have so many incredible artists as well, and we also have real tangible places like Fort Mose that you mentioned, which is the original first free Black colony in the United States. And it was not only free for Black people, but also for indigenous Native Indians as well. And it was a free colony. And it, in many ways, is the origin point of the Freedom Trail. So we have been dealing with racial inequality or racial tensions for a long time in this part of the country. Do you have any thoughts about things that Jacksonville could do better, not just acknowledging our history, but to take our current situations and turn them into something long-lasting and beautiful for future generations?
That's a huge question, really. And
I can break it down if you'd like.
And you began with, recognition of the wonderful cultural realities that we have, and some of the arts and culture that are rich and can be celebrated. But in thinking about the previous question again, and what some of our weaknesses are, I would be remiss if I didn't mention institutionalized and systemic racism as well. And we really have to turn the momentum of what's going on right now, not just toward individual conversations, but toward tangible systemic changes. So that means addressing issues like police brutality. That means addressing health and education disparities that we have. I've of course been reading recently about the fact that the governor has said that all schools must open. Is it the governor, or is it maybe it's the superintendent here, must open all the public schools for 5 days of instruction at least per week in the coming school year, which of course leads to those issues that we've been seeing in terms of the disparities and racial disparities with COVID-19 in healthcare in general. So if we have more exposure, if we have to get back to school, who are those people who are more likely to not have the medical care that they need based on longstanding systemic health disparities that we have? So all of these kinds of issues are they're pertinent. They have to be addressed right now. And this goes far beyond just the, I want to, see your culture and celebrate this culture, the music, the art, the whatever, the food, whatever the case might be, or even the history, to recognizing the problems and the inequities that we're facing right now along multiple institutional levels.
Well, as a professor, let's talk a little bit about how the University of North Florida might be preparing to bring students back onto campus. And also, what are some of your, do you have any concerns or questions about how that's going to affect not only you, but also your student body?
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is it's a big concern, and it's a big stressor, I think, for a lot of students and faculty as well, staff, for everyone, because this is an issue about our very lives, right? So we have to take into account how people are feeling in terms of their comfort, their safety, their even predisposed conditions that predispose them to perhaps being hit harder by the virus if they contract it. So all of these things are important for us to recognize. I know that there is a team working on these kinds of guidelines and requirements for moving back onto campus, but I'm really pleased that so far it sounds as if those who are requesting to take classes or to teach classes online, that those requests are being recognized and hopefully honored. I'm troubled by what I've recently again read, but haven't read enough in depth, about the fact that international students are not going to be allowed to take a full course load online and still remain in the country. I think that's a huge misstep, but also probably a calculated push against that population, which I can't abide. I think I'm getting off track of your question, honestly. There's,
There are a lot of concerns coming back to school for not only
yeah,
students and professors. Safety is number one because this is a life-threatening illness. It has the potential to spread very pervasively, and also it has the potential to kill people from all age groups and demographics. So safety and health should be a priority. And it is, yes, like you mentioned in recent days, I believe it's ICE, immigration enforcement, that has made a declaration that international students who take only online courses may not qualify to continue their student visa, and they may be sent back. And that is terrifying for a lot of students that are from other parts of the country, let alone other hemispheres, and I mean other parts of the world, not just you know, North America, South America, but traveling and returning to a country may also continue to spread COVID and
right.
across the world. So this move not only affects our students, it affects the international population as well of our global neighbors.
Right. Yeah.
We will
You'd
see.
also asked about kind of a personal response. And I think as well, what's going on with the grade level schools, because I have an 11-year-old daughter, a rising sixth grader. And it's gotten me thinking about obviously the economic privileges that are involved with these decisions as well.
Really,
So
let's talk about that.
on the one hand, we have I sense a discomfort in just the mandate that children have to, or that schools have to be open for 5 days a week of instruction. And so I obviously then am a little more comfortable with the idea of her continuing the virtual classes online for the school year, but we have the means to do that. We have multiple computers in the house so that I can do my work and she can do her work. We have those kinds of resources that not everyone has, and that even at the university level, I know that there have been some efforts to help students with who maybe lack the hardware in order to do the work online, but that those resources, as far as I know, are limited and maybe have even run out. And then there are the considerations of access to the internet and where someone lives, and those kinds of technological issues that can prevent someone from having a productive experience in an online class. So things are not necessarily even and equitable in that way as well.
I see. And a lot of communities of low income, they also have a added risk and an added deficit, in that when you have young children in the family, it takes maybe a whole village to raise them, and
That's
you
right.
can't maybe expose the children to their grandparents or their aunts and uncles or cousins, or even babysitters. When the adults have to go back to work and the students have to go back to school,
Right.
how do you encourage safer childcare as well?
Right.
The students are required to be in physical attendance.
Right.
And it's also within the classroom. How do you have a classroom of 30 children stay 6 feet apart from one another?
Mm-hmm.
They might be too young or innocent to understand that, a mask is mandatory, whether it's comfortable or not.
Right. And try getting kids to stop touching their faces, right?
Right. Or each other, right.
Exactly. It's an intricate web. It really is. And I think there's been too little attention to the kind of exponential impact that even one interaction can have, right? Because people have already been in contact with who knows how many other people, and on and on. And they will then go home to how many people. So.
Right. And I'm sure that's a concern for many students who are also parents themselves.
Right.
And that's a very interesting concern. I would like to maybe open the floor to you a little bit and talk about what we can do better in our, at least for the University of North Florida, to not only be more inclusive, but also more racially diverse, as opposed to celebrating the culture and arts of different heritages that we bring to the table as a diverse university. Would you recommend any type of literature or any type of documentaries? People are always on their computers these days. What would you do to help students who want to feel empowered and educated on diversity and racial issues?
There are so many resources, and I know that anything I mention right now, there's already a meme or a Google Doc that's gone around, and people have seen the name. So they are so easy to find. So Googling is a step, because I'm not going to mention everything.
Oh, I believe your audio cut out.
Obviously, but hello, can you
Yeah,
hear me?
hello.
We'll play that game. It's
Right.
telling me again that my connection is unstable, so thank you for just tell me to repeat when I need to. But
okay, yes, and I'll wait for you to finish, but yes.
Okay.
So
So the resources are very easy to find because there are so many people awakening and doing that type of work in terms of compiling documents that will point people who want to learn different things in different directions. So Ibram Kendi, of course, Stamped from the Beginning, How to Be an Anti-Racist. The book White Fragility is useful as well. There and on in terms of anti-racist work. There are plenty of, because I'm a teacher of English, I teach a lot of African American literature. So, starting locally, we can think about James Weldon Johnson and his work. He has an interesting autobiography as well called Along This Way. Zora Neale Hurston taught and lived in St. Augustine for a while, and so there's her work I always recommend. But even in terms of not just these kind of cultural or anti-racist readings or films that we can all be watching, you'd started the question with thinking about what we need to do even at UNF, and we need to deal with UNF's racial history, with UNF's racist history at UNF, in terms of the fact that it's located where it is because of white flight, and to kind of get away from an urban core population. So that issue, I think, is important to deal with, because you had asked about diversifying our own demographic. So I think that's a necessary step before gaining community trust, so that we can recruit and retain more diverse students and faculty and staff that kind of are more aligned with our city's demographics, and in particular the students and faculty demographics are low, and so I want to make sure I mention that as well, that we as a university have to deal with that history. We have to be much more active in recognizing the community, the full community in Jacksonville, and how while for them. Yeah.
Can you go back and just finish the sentence from we have to be recognizing the full history of Jacksonville?
Oh, golly. No, I'm sorry. I don't remember what I said.
It's important for the University of North Florida to address issues that have to do with its history. And I think the University of North Florida is a strong enough community to be able to do that. And
I think enough of the university is enacting anti-racist efforts now that we can actually make some positive changes.
Yes, I think that, and especially with the training, I believe freshmen will receive training on race relations when they come into school. And I think professors, faculty are also getting trained on issues regarding race. And that's,
I'm not sure what the student curriculum will look like. I know that there has been for a while through student affairs, the cultural competency pursuits, 6 classes, if I remember correctly. I don't know if that's what this new mandate entails. But as I said before, I know that a lot of departments, we in the English department are actively working on anti-racist faculty development. The writing program and writing center are working on anti-racism in the first year writing curriculum. So it goes beyond, the efforts do and should go beyond, classes that teach us how to be more culturally aware and inclusive. And they also have to go into how we are building our classes, how we are teaching our classes, how we are responding to the needs of a variety of students, how we are providing resources for students of diverse backgrounds and, again, meeting their needs.
I think that's, at least we're taking some first steps, and we'll see how it works out in the fall. But it is a very interesting step to take for a university. And I think a lot of universities across the country are not necessarily letting the outside world into campus and talking about it during a time when young people are interested and passionate about these issues. Let's talk a little bit about anti-racism as well. Yes, there is definite racism towards people of color in our country's history, and even in this year, in the history of 2020. I also want to recognize and maybe touch on the topic of a term called reverse racism, or even self-hating racism. I'm not sure if those topics are, I'm not sure if I fully understand those topics, but I'd like to discuss it a little bit. Can you put those terms into more context for myself and our viewers to understand better?
Well, the first, reverse racism, that's a loaded term, and it means different things to different groups of people. The people who typically use that term, I think, mean that they are witnessing or believe that they're witnessing racism that is going in a direction that it hasn't typically gone. So, for example, people have talked about affirmative action being reverse racism. When we also need to recognize, and so there's another group of people who recognize a different kind of history that would suggest that racism it involves power. It involves the ability to exert power over and or to oppress another group of people. So in that sense, we would see a problem in using that term reverse racism if the reversal doesn't involve an application of power, because it hasn't typically in a white supremacist society. Those accusations of reverse racism are typically not ones that involve the exertion of power on the dominant group. So
I see.
we also have to think, in terms of that one example of affirmative action, how much affirmative action there has been toward the dominant group all along. And so we can think, for example, of the GI Bill and who was able to actually benefit from that in large part. We can think of redlining, and
What is that?
Redlining is this practice of allowing mortgages basically to certain groups of people in certain areas and not allowing those to others. So what we've seen, even in terms of, here's another good book to read, Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, where she details the history of the Great Migration, but also goes nice and far back to talk about the wealth building that has happened because of land ownership. So if for the majority of this country's history, Black people, for example, have not been the homeowners, the landowners, then what kind of generational wealth is accrued by those who do own land and do own homes that has then set them up for a totally different life experience? So, so that idea about affirmative action being reverse racism ignores the affirmative actions that have been taken all along, or simply the fact, right, that one of the a good job in the like 1950s would have been a postal, a U.S. Postal Service job, and it was, and earlier, of course, but it wasn't until the 1950s when Black people could have those jobs. So if we think about, again, the generational and economic wealth that gets built up because of those kinds of laws and mandates and practices, then the charge of reverse racism really doesn't hold. The other term that you mentioned really is internalized racism. So that idea, you know, that even W.E.B. Du Bois talked about in 1903 in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, this idea of double consciousness, wherein one person, well, he uses the term Negro at the time. So the Negro recognizes, and he uses the masculine himself as both a Negro and an American, and has to kind of deal with this dueling consciousness, and can therefore sometimes internalize that dominant view about him or herself. So those racist attitudes the society continually reinforces through representation, for example, then get internalized. And we see that has happened with children of color. We see them, you know, we know about the study in the 1940s using the dolls and asking white children and Black children, which is the pretty doll, which is the good doll, which is the smart doll, which is the ugly doll, you know, and consistently Black and white children would choose the white looking doll for the favorable qualities and the Black doll for the negative qualities. So already that would be internalized racism happening in children.
I see.
And Black children.
I see, and that stretches not just from the 1950s, but all the way through the late 90s, early 2000s, mid 2000s, when Barbie, for example, started to finally produce dolls that were, you know, had different texture hair, that had different skin tones, that had
different body shapes.
Different body shapes as well, even different careers, typically more masculine careers. The dolls were then, you know, into STEM sciences and such things. So it seems like it's a slow trickle of a progress, and that the internalized racism, the struggle that you discussed, the gentleman speaking of, whether he's an American or if he's an African-American person, you know, I can personally relate to that, having an Indian heritage and being born and raised and fully American in many ways. There's a balance you have to strike within yourself, and that can be very difficult. You know, one of my implicit privileges is that I'm able to somehow know somewhere where my family came from, that I can look back and compare my Eastern heritage to my Western life. And I think that there is a disconnect in the Black community from being able to connect to their roots. And so perhaps there's even more pain, even more grief there. And, you know, that is more than just a generational struggle. That is a forever loss. And is there anything that we can do to support our fellow loved ones who are Black and who are struggling with a myriad of internalized, externalized types of racism and bias against them? What is something that an outsider like me or my viewers could do to just support the people we care about?
I think the first step for, I would say, everyone is self-work. Do the work on yourself to understand where your own implicit biases are, to recognize those places in yourself that maybe need excavation and challenging, rooting out, transformation. I think that's a crucial area of support, and I think it's pretty universal. And my opinion is only one of many. There are plenty of people I've heard who say, let Black people organize for themselves, and so just be there to support and be, kind of on the sidelines, help for whatever they need. And then there are other people, who say, okay, white people need to have their own conversations. Don't rely on Black people to educate you, that you have to do that work as well, because there's already a lot of uncompensated labor that Black people do, and emotional labor that Black people do in that regard. Some people say listen. Other people say listening isn't enough. I was facilitating a conversation on race in a yoga studio this past weekend, and one white woman shared that story of being told by a Black woman that listening isn't enough. She has to do something. So that woman's opinion isn't mine. I think that honest, open conversations are helpful. I think brave listening is helpful, wherein one is not automatically defensive and can therefore really listen to what someone is trying to convey. I think that's helpful. So there's a lot that can be done, and people have different opinions on what that should be. But I think everyone doing that self-work is
Hello. If you can hear me, I just want to say can you hear me? Hello?
moving. Can you say something?
Yes.
Okay, we're back.
We're back. The Wi-Fi is just not on our side today.
No, it's a little gray out.
I really appreciate all of the examples of how people can approach this topic on their own and listen and educate themselves and act. One thing I really admire that you said was brave listening. And I think for people that want to be of use and want to be united in this country, regardless of race or differences, I think it can be an act of courage and bravery to sit down and really read these books, these amazing books you've mentioned already today, educate yourself, and to look at your own life and see where your privileges come from, and to see what other people's experiences are. It is not only a brave thing to sit down and listen and say, what can I do as somebody who is not from your culture? What can I do to just support you and listen to what they say and then do it, whatever it may be? But it's also an act of courage to be empathic and to put your put your feet in someone else's shoes. And in my experience from this year, 2020 has already been a very difficult year for people who are empaths and naturally compassionate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're so right, and I'm so glad that you brought up that other side, because when you reiterated the idea of brave listening, I thought compassionate as well, and compassionate speaking, as much as we're able, and which every time I talk about compassion, I think about the roots of that word. Passion means suffering. Compassion means to suffer with. What are we willing to suffer for each other is a question that I think needs to be asked and answered individually, because that practice of empathy demands it. And the bravery, of course, is in the face of our natural human fears. But when I teach yoga, I remind, and even in the literature classroom, sometimes I remind students that I that there are two emotions that we deal with, that we work from. Sorry.
Sometimes you remind students what?
That there are two emotions that we work from, and that all the other emotions kind of stem from those, and those are love and fear. So can we identify the root of what we're thinking, feeling, speaking, how we're acting? You know, is it coming from that place of love, or is it coming from that place of fear? And honestly, which would we rather be working from? So
right. It is a very mindful and conscious approach to this issue. Like you said, compassion is, what are we willing to suffer with each other? You know, like, what are we willing to suffer together with?
So I'm glad you brought mindfulness up too. I'm actually writing a book right now called The Mindful Classroom. That's why I'm thinking of all of this right now. It's about bringing these kind of mindful yogic techniques and philosophies to bear on these conversations, so that we can have productive dialogue and then necessary change.
I look forward to reading that book. I think I can learn a lot from it as well. And as somebody who has, you know, learned how to do yoga at a young age, and learned the importance of meditation throughout my life, based on my cultural roots, I'm very moved and excited for a book like that, because I also love to learn, and Lord knows I've been in school for too long. So, you know.
There are worse things.
There are. That's true. That is true. But I think it is a matter of being conscious, and perhaps in a roundabout way, 2020 will turn out to be a blessing in many ways. I'm watching the news of the day every day because it's my job, but I'm also watching the overarching narrative our country's going through. And it is almost like a renaissance, a enlightenment period of where we go through a dark time to better understand, to better have the time to address these things that have been with us for so long. And maybe 2020 will not only bring our country together, but bring the world together. I think it's too easy to fear the divisiveness that we see, to see that one side hates the other when it comes to a myriad of topics, not just race, not just socioeconomics, healthcare, politics. Our country, it's too easy, in my opinion, to see the differences and get stuck in that dichotomous thinking. What I'm beginning to notice is that people are going within to cope with being isolated and being scared, and that fear runs out. Fear is exhausting. Anger has a shelf life. It burns out like a little sparkler on 4th of July. It'll burn out, you know, eventually. Anger fades. And below it is where I'm seeing this introspection, this need for connection as well, and these elements of compassion and brave listening are coming back out to the surface. And I hope that continues. We will see.
Likewise. Yeah.
Right. If you had any last remarks or last thoughts for the students at the University of North Florida about coping with the racial tensions in our country right now, what would those be?
I think would start by encouraging people to find their strengths, and also to find their support system. There's so much work that needs to be done. And I would want to remind people that not every one person has to do everything. We don't all march in the streets. We don't all create the Google Doc with the list of resources. We don't all have the conversations, but some of us do. Some of us have the conversation with family, and some of us march in the streets, and some of us create artwork, and some of us write, and some of us teach. So find that strength and share that in this fight, in this anti-racist fight, because that's where one can sustain the work, but one also needs the support system to sustain the work and to remain resilient. So we need those groups in which we can stay vulnerable and relax and take a breather, take a break. That this is an ongoing, necessarily sustained and overlapping effort, so that one person can take the baton when another needs a breather. Yeah, and then always keep working on oneself, and don't let yourself be driven to the point of exhaustion, because we need fighters in the fight.
Well, thank you very much for that. That was beautifully said.
Thank you.
And I have really appreciated your time today, Dr. Tru Leverette.
I've enjoyed our talk as well. Thank you for your insightful questions.
You're welcome. Thank you. This is the way I contribute to the world, is by having open, honest conversations with people. So thank you for your time. And well, I guess that wraps up another special edition of Spinnaker News. Tune in next time to see more. And thank you, as always, for watching.